welcome to the 32nd episode of Let's Talk About Electric Vehicles. My name is Teresa, I'm an economist, and together with my co-host Theo, I talk about electric vehicle related topics in this podcast. Hello, Theo!
Ciao!
In episode 30, we compared the total lifetime emissions of different vehicle technologies, and we learned that whether or not the electric vehicle outperforms the internal combustion engine depends on the particular calculation model you use in order to derive the total emissions, and also what kind of assumptions you make to feed this model. Today, we will continue comparing the technologies, but this time in terms of money.
Yes, but first, I'd like to do a quick correction on a past episode. Back in episode 25, I talked about the history of batteries and about Alessandro Volta, who is credited with creating the first chemical battery. I said that Volta was French and that the battery was a pile, pronounced pile in French. But, gasp, Volta is Italian, and there we go. And in Italian, it's a pila. So thanks to our listener Giorgio for calling this out, and
thank you, Giorgio. Thank you.
Mi dispiace.
Mi dispiace too.
Okay, back to our regularly scheduled programming, the monetary costs of owning an electric car.
Yeah, this is very important because the consumers will choose the vehicle type with the best cost-benefit ratio, and then the global market will follow the consumer's decisions. But the problem is, it is really hard to tell which technology is the most affordable. So, therefore, the outline of today's episode is the following. First, we are going to explain how market analysts and researchers have calculated the total cost of ownership so far. We will keep this relatively short because actually I talked about it already in episode 10.
Yes, although there are a couple areas of the standard total cost of ownership or TCO model that I'd like to dig into a bit more. One is the devaluing of future expenditures, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then the other is the differences in charging costs between home charging versus public charging.
And then we will discuss two other ways to think about cost and benefit of owning electric vehicles. One of them is the usage experience. What I mean by that is that do both technologies really offer the same benefit and therefore require equal cost? Or is one of them superior and it would thereby be justified to have a higher cost? So this is the one thing. And the other point is the potential monetary effects when you include the social cost of carbon. Theo and I have been brainstorming about how to best incorporate these factors in the comparative cost analysis. But first things first, let us explain the conventional approach. As for the perspective of the consumer, previous research used the so-called total cost of ownership, so TCO models, that usually account for the purchasing price, the fuel cost, so electricity and fuel, and for maintenance, for incentives, insurance, and any other government fees on electric vehicles. Well, if you are an avid listener of this podcast, you probably guessed what I'm about to say. The results depend on the assumptions made. Probably the most important assumption is the chosen set of the reference vehicles, hence which vehicle models to compare. That entails deciding on a vehicle segment first and then deciding on the particular vehicle models to compare. So with the reference vehicle comes along the purchasing price and the fuel or the electricity consumption. Fun fact, the electric vehicle performs better in bigger vehicle segments where the high cost of the battery is not as much of a penalty relative to the rest of the car. This is the reason why electric cars are considered relatively more expensive in Italy, for example, where consumers prefer smaller vehicles, than in the US, where people love their giant cruise ships of a vehicle. Well, speaking of different countries, the country or the region can also have another very significant effect on the TCO analysis. The region obviously affects fuel and electricity prices, but also potential governmental incentives, taxes, and even the purchasing price of the exact same vehicle could vary across different countries.
Yeah, and so speaking of electricity prices, that was one of the things that I wanted to dig into more that can have a significant effect on EV charging costs, even within the same region, because the costs of public charging are different than the costs of like charging at your house. So where I am in Washington State, the cost of public charging is generally 2 or more times that of private. For example, I pay at my house 12 cents per kilowatt hour, but a Tesla charger charges around 28 cents, and then other charging networks charge as much as 39 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's like almost 4 times as much.
That's a big difference. So where I live in Edmonton, I pay only about 6 Canadian cents per kilowatt hour at home.
Wow, that's half even what I pay at home. That would have a huge effect.
Yeah. And then there are also the free chargers. It depends. I mean, it's a researcher's decision whether or not you could incorporate the free charging option in your total cost of ownership analysis. But technically, it is possible to pay 0 cents to charge your car.
Yeah, that would be great. In my area, at least, the free chargers are a little harder to use. Like you would have to go out of your way to find them. It's kind of a fun game, but in my area, not a practical way for people to charge their cars. But I can see how, depending on the person, they may want to do that, and then it totally changes their math.
Yeah, that's just more evidence that total cost of ownership is a very local thing, and it even is a very personal thing. I mean, if you're charging at home, you are probably getting a lower total cost of ownership, but if you're willing to go to the free charging stations, then even better. But yeah, it depends on your personal requirements.
Yep.
And finally, there are also some technical assumptions that impact the results. For example, the usage behavior. What I mean by that is the annual mileage and the years of ownership. As you know, electric vehicles typically have a higher upfront purchasing price compared to gas vehicles, followed by a relatively lower operating emissions. So therefore, if you are an electric vehicle enthusiast and you want them to have an advantage in the calculation, you just need to assume a higher mileage. Also, it is very common in economics to devalue future payments, and you will have to make an assumptions about this interest rate or this depreciation factor. And the higher the depreciation of future payments, the better for the gas car because it devalues the future fuel costs.
Right, and so the gas car is cheaper up front, but then you pay for the fuel in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what kind of values do studies use when devaluing future payments? Like what percentage are they devaluing it?
Yeah, so something between 2 and 5%. I know you were very curious about why researchers do that. I think there's generally 2 reasons. Well, first of all, the human nature just devalues future payments. They just naturally take payments from today more serious than payments in the future. And then the second thought is you could also invest the money somewhere else, and it's sort of the opportunity cost of the interest payments that you would have gotten if you would have invested the money somewhere else.
I see. So if the EV costs $5,000 more, so the gas car costs $5,000 less, the theory is you could take that $5,000, invest it in the stock market or somewhere, and then over the 6 or 10 years that you own the car, that money would be growing, and you basically get money back from that. Whereas in the EV case, you're paying it up front, so you can't invest it, and there's a loss of value there.
Yeah. So yeah, this is one of the reasons why economists or any market analysts will use this depreciation factor of future payments. It is not that significant. So most of the robustness checks, or robustness check means that you want to find out the impact of certain assumptions, and most robustness checks of the total cost of ownership analysis find that this interest rate does not really make that much of a difference.
Gotcha. Okay.
Anyways, if you, the listener, are still keen on learning more about the previous about previous total cost of ownership research, then you can check out episode 10. But for now, that's it for the overview of the conventional total cost of ownership calculations. And now let's talk about the two factors that previous literature does not address, which is the user experience and the social cost of carbon emissions. Why is it so important to include this whole driver experience or usage experience? My thought is the following. A simple cost comparison only makes sense if you get the exact same benefit from both products. So no one would come up with the idea to compare a VW Polo with a Ferrari. Of course, a Ferrari is much more expensive, but therefore it delivers a higher value to the consumer. And the higher price is therefore justified. Electric cars oftentimes are seen as just a cleaner version of the conventional car, and therefore it is assumed that if the electric car costs just a couple of bucks more than a gas car, then people will refuse to buy it. So my question here is, what if electric cars offer a higher value to the consumer than any gas car in terms of the experience? So
yeah, there are a few areas that we think the EV experience differs from the gas vehicle experience. And the first one is the fueling
Theo
process.
And I did a bit of brainstorming.
Either putting the gas in or putting the electricity in. So in the case of gas, there's time spent at the gas station, which is pretty straightforward. The best case for time spent at the gas station would be, let's say, if you drove 10,000 miles per year. I did some calculations and came up that you might have to make 20 visits to the gas station. And if each of those visits was 10 minutes, it's around 3 hours at the gas station.
3 hours of my precious time. 3 hours per year. If that really makes that much of a difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, how you value that. Yeah, it's a very personal thing, right? Like, certainly you can put a number on what your time is worth. Maybe you value yourself at $50 an hour or something. But there's also when are you spending that time? And if someone were to say, here, I'll give you some money to go stand outside and breathe gas fumes for 10 minutes. Like, how much money would you ask them to give you to do that? Like, would you?
Well, Theo, you're obviously very biased in the EV enthusiastic section, because it also takes time to charge your car. And I know the ideal case is that you charge overnight and then you plug it in at work and you don't really have to think about it. So this is where you would spend zero time with the whole charging process. But we both know that this is not always the case. Sometimes you have to visit public charging stations where you also spend 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes there.
Yeah, I did some math on that, and I totally agree. Like, if you were just charging at public charging stations, and if 200 miles charge would take you 20 minutes, and you were driving the same 10,000 miles, you would spend like 17 hours at the charging station. So you definitely have to account for like how you're doing your charging and whether you're doing long trips.
And time is not everything. What I would also consider as experience or as convenience is the whole mental experience, because if I have to think about, when I'm gonna go to the next gas station again, do I have time? Shall I do it between these two meetings? That's a mental effort for me. And if I would not have to do this with the electric vehicle, then that's great. That would give me a lot more utility out of the electric vehicle versus the gas vehicle. Then on the other hand, if I want to do a longer trip and I have an electric vehicle with a limited driving range, and I have to think about, can I even go to this remote area in a day? Can my electric car even go that far? Do I have to worry about that? That's a lot of mental effort too. So it's hard. How would you incorporate this in a total cost of ownership analysis? How would you say which technology gives you more convenience? It's very personal. It's very individual, very personal. But still, I find it important to mention it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to talk about the time in some sort of quantifiable way, just so that you can put a floor. Like, I mean, if you're someone who's making good money, that's like a significant amount of your time. Why spend it? But yeah, it's very personal.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a fueling process. And another convenience thing or experience thing for me is the smell and the dirt, which you won't have with the electric car, but you would have it with the gas car. It smells like gasoline. You could spill gasoline. It is dirty. You breathe in the delicious gas fumes, which is, by the way,
which are probably not great for you.
Yeah, which is not great for you, which brings me to a whole other topic, which is health issues, especially with diesel cars, the health risk. I was thinking how you could possibly quantify this and include it in a total cost of ownership analysis. Well, you could eventually, we have different values for scenarios of urban air quality with different vehicle technologies, and we could then eventually calculate the health damage and then calculate the economic damage that results from that health damage somehow. But it's still, like, you could eventually convert it to monetary terms. It drives me crazy that no total cost of ownership analysis even considers that, because it somehow has a monetary effect. But yeah, but then on the other hand, how to incorporate it, it is hard, but I still want to mention it.
I mean, it's part of the interesting part is that it's not just a monetary effect on you directly, but a monetary effect on society, which we'll get to later.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that makes it hard to measure.
Because if you damage the health of the people, then they would need more health services, which drives up the taxes, which is bad for your own income.
Okay, so yeah, let's talk about maintenance time. So this is one area that I think electric cars clearly win at.
Biased.
For a gas car.
Someone's biased here.
No, I'm happy to. Yes, I am. So for a gas car, that's probably mostly oil changes. You need roughly 4 oil changes a year if you're doing it every 3,000 miles. Each one takes, about an hour. With electric, you probably need around half as many maintenance visits. Like, you still have to take it in to make sure that everything's copacetic. So 2 visits a year versus 4 visits a year, you're saving another couple hours. Add that onto your tally.
But again, it's so individual, and but it's still important to include it in a calculation. One more thing that I find worth mentioning is the whole winter driving. Electric vehicles are more convenient in the winter because, well, 2 things. First of all, the instant heat, and also you don't have a problem with starting the engine. Whereas with a gas car, the tiny 12-volt battery can suffer a lot from the cold, and then you have problems.
But depending on which electric vehicle and how good the battery is at handling the cold, you also have reduced range in the winter, which could be pretty annoying. And how do you value that?
That's annoying. Yeah, there's one more thing. The whole vehicle to grid and mobile energy topic, which is something that the electric vehicle as a product can where the electric vehicle as a product can offer a higher benefit to the consumer than a gas car will ever be able to do. How can you translate this into monetary terms? My thought was the following. So if everyone uses the electric vehicle as mobile energy to smooth the load curve, then the utility company would need less investments. So they could offer electricity at a lower price.
Yep, it's true.
That was my thought. And of course, it comes along with many more advantages. But this is just something that the gas car will never be able to offer.
Bias.
The
other thing is that if you have the vehicle to grid stuff working, you can potentially use your vehicle as backup power in case of power outages. I mean, it seems strange that in this day and age it still happens, but every once in a while, at least in my area, there's a power outage because a storm blows down power lines, and then being able to plug your car into your house and have power for a day or two is certainly useful.
Yeah, as an emergency power instead of investing in an emergency generator.
But it is worth noting that the vehicle to grid stuff isn't actually supported by any of the EVs out there, at least not that I'm aware of. I've heard about the Nissan Leaf maybe doing it, but I don't think that's finalized yet.
If you, the audience, come up with any more ideas, please feel free to reach out to us. And with that being said, let's move on to the social cost of carbon, which is also a very important point.
Yes.
Because carbon emissions cause global warming, they cause floods, they cause wildfires. Oh, how do you pronounce
droughts?
Thank you. And many more tragedies that harm the economy and therefore cost us money. So why not including these costs of carbon emissions in the calculation? The consumers are having a hard time connecting their actions with the consequences, but that doesn't change the fact that the consumers suffer from the consequences of emission-intensive vehicles. There is a study from 2018 by Ricke and others, you will find it in the show notes, that calculated these social costs of carbon for different countries, but it is worth mentioning that this study only considers the possible impact of global warming on each country's economy, including the effect on agriculture, the effect on the heating or the cooling cost, etc., etc. It does not include the direct damage of floods or any other direct effects of climate change. So the actual cost could be much higher if those factors were included as well.
Yeah, so what they did was to calculate a total global cost, global impact of each ton of carbon, and then they allocated that cost to each country, saying like, okay, the United States for each ton of carbon is going to be impacted this much, and Russia this much, and India this much, et cetera, et cetera. And so, for example, the number that they came up with for the United States was $48 per ton of carbon emitted.
These are all costs that the taxpayer will have to face.
So one thing I noticed about this study is that it devalues the cost, and we talked about this earlier when we were talking about the cost of the purchase cost of EVs. In this case, it's kind of the reverse. This study devalues the cost of these future damages, and if you don't devalue the future costs, the social cost is much higher, right?
I know it may sound confusing to you, but it is a very common approach in economics that you always devalue future payments. But with that being said, let's have a look at the effect of the social cost of carbon on the total cost of ownership. So on an individual consumer's level. First of all, let's use the example of total life cycle emissions from episode 30, where we, for example, came up with 20.4 tons CO2 equal for the Tesla Model 3 versus 26.2 tons CO2 equal for the Toyota Camry.
Okay, so 20 versus 26.
That would result, if you multiply it with the social cost of carbon, that would result in $979 US dollars for the Tesla and in $1,257 US dollars for the Camry over the lifetime of each vehicle. So that's a difference of $300. How would you include this in the total cost of ownership? I mean, can you even include it?
Yeah, because those numbers express the impact on the whole country rather than the impact on the person doing the emission, right?
Yeah, you're not necessarily going to get paid back yourself for driving an emission-intensive vehicle.
Yeah, but you might, for example, if you like own real estate in Miami, Florida, or some other place that's likely to experience an outsized impact.
You're cruel.
Well, it's already happening,
yeah.
So
I had an idea of how the social cost of carbon actually already impacts the total cost of ownership. So far, we have only talked about the consumer's perspective, right? But what about the government's perspective and the whole country's economy? A responsible government would evaluate the total cost of an electrified transportation system and compare it with the total cost of an oil-based transportation system and conclude that the one that saves them money in the long run is worth subsidizing. So this subsidy then decreases the total cost of ownership for the consumer. So therefore, one could say that the total cost of ownership analysis somewhat already accounts for the social cost of carbon, given the government acts in a benevolent way for the country's economy.
Right. But if the country doesn't have significant incentives for EV or less emitting vehicle driving, then it's kind of up to the individual to be that benevolent, right? To reduce their emissions, keeping in mind.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. We had this discussion earlier. For me, it is a problem of complexity. The problem is that you don't really understand. You cannot connect the consequences with the actions. You don't understand that global warming it has an effect on agriculture, which will eventually make your grocery bill get higher. You don't understand that this is somewhat related to your emission-intensive vehicle or some other actions that cause high carbon emissions.
Yeah, but I feel like the point of the social cost of carbon is to boil that complexity down into a number that you can understand. And even if, like, let's say it's $50 a ton, even if it's not necessarily you who's going to be paying that $50, I mean, first of all, it's probably your kids, and then it may be someone else's kids who live in Miami. It still I think makes it easier for you to think about here's a number, and it's probably the low end of the real number. Here's a number that I can use to say if I emit this ton of carbon, I am doing this much damage to someone, and as a benevolent person, I can choose not to do that damage.
So for you, it's a question of morality.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's a question of education and understanding information.
Yeah, information is good.
Because in the end, everyone tries to make the best decision for themselves, and then maybe at a second instance for the society. And if you don't know what the best option is, then you cannot make that decision.
Yep, that's true. And maybe we should do we can start a separate podcast on philosophy and the existence of altruism.
Of climate change. Okay, let's do that. But for now, we have talked about what we wanted to talk about. What is the conclusion of this episode?
Yeah, well, I think the conclusion is that it is very personal, and that really before you make a decision on an electric versus a gas car, you really need to figure out the total cost of ownership for your specific area based on your specific moral compass and all these factors.
Yeah, the best way is to just take a spreadsheet yourself. You just can't apply a random total cost of ownership result that you read somewhere in a random article. You cannot apply this to your personal situation because it depends on so many individual factors that you really have to make your own individual total cost of ownership analysis.
So are we going to share out a spreadsheet that people can use to plug in their own assumptions?
a little homework for us.
I don't know.
Well, I have a spreadsheet actually, but it's not super nice yet. But we can work on it. I will post it on Facebook. With that being said, we have reached the end of this episode about the total cost, or about just the cost of electric vehicles. We hope that you've enjoyed it and that you have learned something new. Let us know if you have any comments or suggestions about both the user experience or the social cost of carbon and how to implement it in the cost analysis.
Also, if you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe on your podcast app and leave a review if you can. And yeah, if you have any of that feedback, all of our contact info is available on our website at evtalk.co.
Yep, I'm excited to talk about electric vehicles again soon. And have a wonderful remainder of your day, your week, and bye!
Arrivederci!